Cuidado que saiu uma porrada de gente.
É.
Eu, hein? Bom, a palestra que vocês vão ouvir vai ser ministrada pelo professor George Bisharat, que é um professor da faculdade mais antiga de Direito da Califórnia, né? Mais tradicional, fica em São Francisco, né? E ele é professor de processo penal, né? E é um professor, né, of law, né? Ele é um professor titular. E ele também foi defensor público lá na cidade de São Francisco, né, durante muitos anos, até ele virar professor dessa universidade. Aí não era compatível o horário e tal, ele largou a defensoria. Então, ele tem muita experiência em advocacia, né, além da experiência. E ele lá nessa faculdade de Direito, ele leciona uma clínica, né, de prática forense, que é completamente diferente de qualquer coisa que vocês possam ter imaginado aqui no Brasil. Muito interessante isso. Inclusive, um dia, para quem se interessar, ele podia, até numa próxima oportunidade, falar sobre isso, né? Porque muitos de vocês são professores de graduação, né? E talvez se interessassem por esse método que ele praticamente inventou, né, de fazer isso. E tem uma colega que auxilia ele, né? Ele faz isso e tal, e tá. E o professor George também é doutor em antropologia, né? Além de se formar em Harvard comigo, né, em Direito, ele se formou também em antropologia, né? Tá, ao mesmo tempo, inclusive, né? Então, não é uma coisa fácil para ninguém fazer. E isso dá dimensão, né? O professor George também é um especialista, né, nesse conflito da Palestina, né, com Israel. Escreveu livros sobre isso, escreveu artigos, etc. E, ultimamente, já nos últimos 10 anos, tem colaborado com o nosso instituto de maneira sistemática, né? E tem demonstrado, né, muito interesse, né, em colaborar com a gente, inclusive academicamente, né? Tanto é que isso que eu mencionei da sugestão dele, né, de algumas pessoas que são amigos dele, são profissionais e tal, da academia e também da profissão, que ele poderia indicar para conversar conosco. Normalmente, a gente tem feito, os nossos colegas que falam outra língua, a gente tem feito gravar, né, a palestra, né, botar legenda, e depois a pessoa vem em público, né, depois de passar a palestra com legenda, a gente faz isso. Mas aqui na Liga de Almeida, os nossos recursos não são tão bons quanto lá na UF, e de modo que ele vai fazer a palestra em inglês mesmo. Ele tem uma pronúncia muito clara, muito escandida, né? O inglês dele é muito pouco sotaque, como é na Califórnia mesmo, né? E ele vai fazer essa palestra exatamente sobre essa questão que eu mencionei antes, que é essa mudança, né, que eles empreenderam no nome da Hastings College of the Law. Descobriram que esse cara não era um cara, né, que merecesse, embora fosse uma pessoa muito importante, né, na época e tal, no século XIX, mas nos Estados Unidos tem um problema com as faculdades de Direito, né, porque havia, no século XIX, autores que diziam que não precisava de faculdade de Direito, porque o direito é aquilo, né, o direito e a moralidade, né, estariam juntos. E como o direito americano é sempre local, né, então a moralidade local e o direito local é a mesma coisa. Então, para que a faculdade de Direito? Né? Tem um livro ótimo sobre isso, muito divertido, né, imaginar no Brasil alguém pensar uma coisa dessa, né? E então as universidades são tardias, né, em direito, né, assim e tal, não são. E tem esse conceito, né, de que toda a sociedade, todo grupo tem direito, né, não é só o que vem do Estado, né? Mas ele vai falar isso, e O Michel vai dar um toque sobre isso também, mas a verdade é que isso é uma rejeição, né, da percepção colonial, né, da percepção que esse cara é negócio de exploração de ouro, matador de índio, tal, não sei o quê, né, dessa expansão colonialista, né, do próprio Estados Unidos sobre, né, os territórios indígenas na Califórnia, na corrida do ouro, né, do século XIX, e coisa que o nosso direito não se preocupa, né, inclusive usa vários institutos ainda, né, que são institutos das ordenações, como, por exemplo, a Inquisício, né, canônica, e das ordenações filipinas, que é um instituto que foi criado em 1871, que é o inquérito policial, que continua regulando, né, nosso processo penal até hoje. As pessoas dizem que ele foi criado em 1941, mas não é verdade. Ele foi criado por uma lei de 1871. E ele reproduz, ipsis literis, as condições da Inquisício, tanto do processo canônico quanto do processo penal das ordenações, né? Então, é muito interessante que, aqui no Brasil, essas coisas não sofrem uma rejeição, etc., ou uma reflexão, né, sobre sua origem, sua importância, e mesmo porque o direito aqui não tem história, né, o direito é uma coisa ahistórica, mas para ter um exemplo de como é que, num lugar, essa coisa é muito, né, fora daqui, ela tem muita atenção, né, chama muita atenção. Então, com isso, eu passo a palavra ao Michel e depois ao George.
Muito obrigado, professor Kant. Bom dia a todos. Agradeço pela presença de vocês aqui na nossa segunda atividade do dia. Já foi apresentado, então, só pro forma. Meu nome é Michel Lobo, sou pesquisador de pós-doutorado FAPERJ, nota 10, aqui no PPGD da UVA. E eu não vou me prolongar, nem vou me apossar da fala do professor George, só vou falar brevemente uma breve conexão, né, e reflexão entre o que ele vai apresentar agora, tá, com algumas características do direito brasileiro, para nós podermos refletir a partir daí, né. Então, de maneira assim, muito sintética, né, a Faculdade de Direito da Califórnia, lá em São Francisco, ela agora, né, como o professor Kant já comentou, é conhecida como University of California College of the Law, São Francisco, ou UC Law SF, para poder abreviar, né. Isso tudo depois que o governador da época assinou um projeto de lei da Assembleia de 1936, revisando o Código de Educação da Califórnia, removendo o nome Hastings da mesma. E esse projeto de lei ele entrou em vigor em 1º de janeiro de 2023, então é algo muito recente, né? Isso reflete o nome recomendado por unanimidade pelo Conselho de Administração daquela universidade, né? Isso também, inclusive, se refletiu na migração e alteração dos endereços de e-mail da universidade, tá? E também na mudança de o endereço do site da universidade também. E toda essa mudança de nome faz parte de um grande esforço maior, de um processo de restauração de injustiças que começou em 2017, em reconhecimento aos danos causados pelo fundador daquela escola, né, Serranus Clinton Hastings, que fundou o college em 1878, com um legado aí de $100 mil para o Estado, patrocinando também uma campanha de genocídio contra a nação Yuk, começando em 1858 e durando até 1860. E essa questão da mudança do nome de Hastings e as suas implicações e constrangimentos sociopolíticos passou por todo um processo de construção de consenso institucional, explícito, até se chegar ao novo nome. Então, foi, portanto, um esforço, né, de auto-reconhecimento que a universidade passou, inclusive do seu nome, né. No entanto, um esforço esse, né, que, no sentido de romper com qualquer aceno a uma tradição colonialista e repressora, inclusive representada na questão do nome de uma universidade. E o que me faz pensar muito no nosso direito brasileiro, o qual tais discussões são poucos importantes ainda, né? No entanto, como já foi comentado aqui mais cedo, existe um corpo de pesquisa que está sendo desenvolvido há algumas décadas no Brasil, a exemplo das produções do âmbito do Instituto Nacional de Ciência e Tecnologia, o Instituto de Estudos Comparados em Administração de Conflitos, o INCT-INEAC, e das suas instituições participantes, o qual o PPGD UVA faz parte também. e que explicitam, com dados empíricos, a naturalização da segmentação da sociedade brasileira em partes desiguais pelo sistema jurídico, não só por critérios econômicos do mercado, como ocorre em diversos países capitalistas, mas também pela ausência do reconhecimento de direitos individuais para vastos grupos sociais em função das representações negativas sobre o seu status. Possivelmente, fruto do nosso passado colonialista e escravocrata, cuja perpetuação não encontra justificativa, portanto, em uma república constitucional como é a proclamada República Brasileira. Muito pelo contrário. Ela reforça que temos um direito pré-moderno. E é justamente isso que faz o PPGD da UVA, né, nesse nosso evento hoje, e a fala do professor George, que vai ser agora a seguir, né, tão importante para nós. Pois, como ele já falou em outros espaços, esperamos que alguns de vocês que estão ouvindo organizem uma campanha ainda melhor do que foi conseguida lá, sobre Hastings, e alcancem um sucesso ainda maior. De novo, é um movimento que houve de rompimento com qualquer aceno a uma tradição colonialista e repressora, inclusive na representação do nome daquela universidade, como vai ser ilustrado agora. Então, após esse breve panorama, inclusive também está circulando aqui algumas traduções impressas, tá, dos pontos do que ele vai falar, não é a palestra inteira, obviamente, tá, que vai ajudar vocês também a contextualizar o que vai ser dito. E aproveito, então, agora para finalizar a minha fala. Foi apenas o intuito de contextualizar com vocês o que ele vai dizer, com aquilo que vai ser dito nas outras mesas do evento hoje, não só no dia de hoje, mas nos dias de online também, até o dia 10 de agosto. Tá? E deixo tudo isso para discussões serem melhoradas a partir daí. Então, termino aqui agora, passo a palavra ao professor George Bisharat. Welcome, George. You have the time you need, you want to speak. So.
Thank you. You have been treated to a lot of introductions and such, but before I dive in, I do want to make sure that I thank the university here for having me, INEAC, my dear friend Roberto, Michelle, my good friend as well, and all of you who have contributed to this event. I also want to recognize the technical crew that's doing all of the recording and broadcasting, and of course Paula, who translated the outline that I think at least some of you have, so that you can better follow my talk. So thank you for all of the effort that has gone into bringing me here to meet with you today. And of course, thank you all for coming, and I will say in advance that I look forward to the questions that you will have and the discussion that we'll have together after I'm done. So it is not an exaggeration to say that we in the United States are in the middle of what might be called a war over commemoration. In other words, I mean by that a prolonged, multi-fronted struggle over how we remember and think about our national history. And needless to say, these struggles over memories of the past are, in fact, not really simply, or I would say even primarily, about the past. The phrase that I use is that these are statements about the future masquerading as statements about the past. We present as if we are speaking about the past. We are really speaking about our present and our future, because in who we choose to commemorate, what names we choose to dignify a building with, or when we erect a statue somewhere, these reflect choices. And in most cases, we are making these choices to honor historical figures for the values that they represent. And we are saying in these choices that these are values worth emulating and extending into the future. Now, there are, of course, also examples of what might be called negative commemoration. These are generally sites that serve us as reminders of bad things that we don't want to have happen again, that we do not want to see recur. So, for example, in the state of Alabama, in the southern United States, in 2018, a national museum and monument was opened that reminds us of the lynchings of black people, which occurred mostly in the southern United States. Up through the last lynching was in 1937, so actually rather recently. So, but these too are not just statements about the past. Instead, they are statements that these crimes should not recur again. We don't want these things happening again. And of course, there are choices that involve both. For example, within the last year, a U.S. military base in the state of North Carolina was changed from Fort Bragg. By the way, this is the largest military installation in the entire world, with 29,000 soldiers stationed there. So it was changed from Fort Bragg to Fort Liberty. Fort Bragg was Bragg, I should say, was a Confederate general. In other words, a general in the army that, in the American Civil War in the 19th century, that fought in support of and to preserve slavery. So we still had that name, Fort Bragg, up until this year. And so in changing the name to Fort Liberty, we are both repudiating a past and asserting a future of liberty. And another example that might resonate with you that I just learned about this morning in conversation was the change of the street name in Niterói to Paulo Gustavo, from the name of a military colonel who, I didn't catch the name of the colonel, so I can't say. Okay, yeah. So again, this is a statement about the values that we want to honor and preserve going forward, and specifically against other values. And so, so the symbolism can be multifaceted. Now, I could cite you many examples of these struggles all around the United States today. Hardly a week goes by in which we do not have some news of a battle somewhere around the United States. Just last week, President Biden established a national monument in honor of Emmett Till and his mother, whose name was Esther Mobley Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old black boy who, in 1955, was tortured and killed by a white mob for allegedly whistling at a white woman, making a sexually tinged approach to her. Whether this, in fact, actually occurred or not is immaterial, but that's what he was accused of doing. His mother, Esther Mobley Till, insisted on an open coffin at her son's funeral so that the world could witness the brutality of his killers. He was beaten and burned and tortured, and she insisted at the funeral that his coffin remain open. And this marked a turning point in the civil rights movement in the United States. So that was just last week. Now, this war is not just about monuments either. There is a more encompassing, a broader fight over how we think about and how we teach our history. For example, Governor Ron DeSantis of the state of Florida, who is a right-wing Republican and who is running now for the presidency as in the Republican primary elections, he has been leading an effort to reform education at the state level. So for kids in elementary school and middle school and high school, what we refer to as K through 12, kindergarten through the 12th grade. In other words, everything before going to the university. So he is trying to reform education at the state level, and apparently part of this entailed textbook revisions in which slavery is described as having endowed black people with job skills. Let's say, for example, learning how to be a blacksmith, from which they could derive personal benefit. As if slavery were a jobs training program. And in fact, the war is especially intense in the world of education, because this is where our children's outlooks are set. Children are especially vulnerable consumers of information. They are open to suggestion, and parents, of course, are protective of students. So this is an especially volatile front, this one of education, in the war of commemoration. Now, I will say, not only is it not just about monuments and statues and buildings, it's also not just a war about memory as such. In many cases, there is an associated struggle over tangible resources, such as land. For example, a place called Bruce's Beach in Los Angeles was returned to a black family just last year after a wrongful and racially discriminatory exercise by the city of the power of eminent domain. Bruce's Beach in the days of segregation in the state of California. And let me just share with you that the state of California, although it has this golden image as the land of opportunity and as the progressive state, its history is very racist and very discriminatory, just like all the other states of the United States. So Bruce's Beach was a small little plot of land along the Pacific Ocean, the beach, where black people were permitted to go. They were prevented from going anywhere else, so they had this one little spot, and the city took it away. The city, on the grounds that they were going to build a park there, they never did, and the family sued to regain the property, and they won, and the land was returned to them just last year. So, we're talking about very concrete, tangible resources. There are also discussions of reparations. Cash payments are, to black people who are descendants of slaves at multiple levels of government. The city of San Francisco had a commission to study the possibility of compensating black people as has the state of California, and of course the discussion is going on at a national level as well. And the idea, of course, in many of these situations is that the racism of the past has had lasting consequences, lasting concrete socioeconomic impacts on people today. And the social inequality that we see today is a legacy of these things like the exercise of eminent domain against the Bruce family. Many Native American tribes are filing lawsuits to regain control or to be compensated for land seized from them and given over to public universities. This happened in the 19th century. So the point is that memory has consequences. These are not just symbolic discussions. There are actions that can flow from taking a particular view of history. So I will be reporting to you now on one skirmish or small battle in this larger war over commemoration that's raging particularly intensely in the United States now. And it is one that is very close to home in the sense that it involves the law school in which I taught for 30 years. And it's also close to home in the sense that I was an active participant in the struggle over the name of the institution. So I was not simply a neutral observer, and I want you to be aware of that, that I took a position and pushed for it. Now, just as a little bit of background, it's worth knowing that the state of California, where I live, and the site of the skirmish that I will report on, is regarded as, well, is a deep blue state. Blue, as you may know, is the color of the Democratic Party in the United States, which is often thought of as the left of US politics. It perhaps is the left of US politics. If you were to put it on an international political sort of spectrum, it would probably be a center-right party, but in the United States, it's regarded as the left. And it is represented by the color blue. And the other, by the way, of course, is the Republican Party, represented by the color red. So when we say blue state or red state, we mean one that's dominated by one party or the other. And if I characterize California as a deep blue state, that means it's really dominated by the Democratic Party in a very sweeping way. So, for example, our governor is a Democrat. Every statewide elected officer, so the Attorney General, the Secretary of State, the Superintendent of Education, all of the officials who are elected on a statewide level, they're all Democrats. Both houses, we have a state assembly, which is 80 members, and we have a state senate, which is 40 members. Both are dominated, controlled by Democrats, and at times the Democrats have had what's called a super majority in those houses, so that the Republican opposition has no leverage whatsoever, can do nothing procedurally to stop legislation initiated by the Democrats. So the Democrats have their way. It hasn't always been this way in the state of California. We gave Ronald Reagan to the world back in the 80s. but it has been true of the state of California for for at least 20 years, for the last 2 decades. It's been deep blue. And these political realities had a very significant impact on how things played out in the case that I'm about to describe to you. So, starting in a way with the conclusion, on September 23rd of last year, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed into law a bill that was called Assembly Bill 1936, and I'll abbreviate it as AB, Assembly Bill. So when I say that in a few minutes, you'll understand what I mean. So this bill renamed the University of California Hastings College of the Law as University of California College of the Law, San Francisco. In other words, the key change was dropping any reference to Hastings. And this was due to revelations that Serenus Clinton Hastings, who had founded the college in 1878 with a bequest of $100,000 in gold coins to the state, had sponsored a campaign of genocide against the Yuki Nation, starting in 1858 and lasting into 1860. This involved mass killings, which occurred in the Eden and Round Valleys of Mendocino County. Today, if you were to drive there from San Francisco, it would take you about 3 hours driving to the north. So, along with other killings by other white settlers, this resulted in in approximately 40-to-1 reduction of the Yuki population in just 10 years. And let me just say that in addition to the bare figures, we have graphic descriptions of how the killings were committed. We have the killers' own descriptions of what they did in writing, in testimony. And believe me, it was brutal. I won't share the details with you, but they're very, very chilling. I'll just say one thing. It involved reference to, for example, clubbing to death an 11-year-old Yuki girl because she was stubborn. That's what the killers wrote in their memoirs. AB 1936, the bill in the Assembly, also enumerated 21 distinct restorative justice measures, including, for example, a commitment to give our law library a Yuki name, Yuki being, again, the name of the Indian tribe that was almost exterminated. Now, here's an interesting thing. The law never received a single negative vote in any of the multiple committees that it had to pass through in both houses, the Assembly and the Senate, nor in floor votes. Not a single negative vote, which is almost unheard of. I mean, every bill practically has opposition, zero opposition to this bill. Now, you might wonder why the law was necessary to change the name, and it was so because what used to be Hastings College of the Law was a public, it was a state institution, and the name of the institution had been written into our education code. So it was actually part of our laws that the college bear that name. So it required an act of the legislature to change it. The law went into effect on January 1st of this year, and the college now is in the process of a thoroughgoing implementation of the name change from our logo to our email addresses, which just, our new addresses became effective July 21st, and our website and everything else is being changed. So I want to offer a preliminary analysis of what contributed to this very significant, but from my perspective, incomplete victory for the recognition of past wrongs and for healing. I do this in the hope that this, that what we learned through our experience might prove useful to others, whether here or in the United States, who are contemplating, who are thinking about similar efforts. Why do I characterize the victory as incomplete? Well, the name Poe Noam, I think you have the spelling in the outline. This is a word from the Yuki language, and it means one people. And it was how the Yuki people used to refer to themselves. They actually were composed of 6 or 7 subgroups, and the name for their collective, when they wanted to talk about all of these 6 or 7 subgroups, they referred to themselves as Poe Noam. So we proposed, me and others, I'll tell you about a little bit, proposed that the school be named Poe Noam. And this initiative failed. We did not succeed in convincing the legislature to adopt that name. So that's why I say it was a victory, but a partial victory.
That was too much.
It was too much. That was too much. That's exactly right. And I'll say how and why it was a little too much. Yeah. So I do want to offer a few thoughts on how we failed, why we failed. So I'm going to start by giving you a very abbreviated, short chronology of what happened leading up to the passage of AB 1936. And there's a lot of effort and a lot of work and many meetings and many things that happened that I can't go into. If we had a day, I could do it, but we're not going to do it in this meeting. And there was a lot of really passionate and really determined effort by a number of very hardworking people. But here are the highlights of the chronology, just the highlights. So in July 2017, in the San Francisco Chronicle, which is the major newspaper, the legacy media newspaper in San Francisco, an op-ed or a commentary, an opinion piece, was published by a local lawyer and amateur historian. I call him an amateur because he's not professionally trained as a historian, nor does he have a post as a professor, but he does history, and he's quite careful and quite thoughtful, and has done some very good work. His name was John Briscoe, and the commentary was titled "The Moral Case for Renaming Hastings College of the Law." And you can infer from the title what the article, what the commentary was about and what it said. In response, the dean of the college, his name is David Fagman, appointed a committee which was called the Hastings Legacy Review Committee that was charged with investigating the facts about Hastings' history, Hastings the man, his history, and how to respond to the allegations that he had committed these crimes. And the Legacy Review Committee took a really long time. I mean, when the dean appointed the committee, it was in the summer of 2017, and he promised that we would have the results from this committee by the fall of that year of 2017. Instead, it took them until 2020. It took them 3 years to do this investigation. The committee did some important and some good work. Among other things, they appointed a historian, a California historian, to look into the facts, which he did, and he corroborated virtually every detail, and much of what we know about what actually happened in 1858 through 1860 is due to the work of this historian commissioned by the committee. But they ultimately failed to reach a consensus on a name change. And instead of making any recommendation at all, they simply said the dean should make this decision. So the dean, took a little further time and recommended to the board of directors of the college that the name not be changed. He was open to other forms of restorative justice, but was against a name change. Now, I will say that I read his memorandum, which was 15 or 20 pages, and to me, it read like a lawyer's brief. It did not read to me like a work of analysis. It read to me like a work of advocacy. And yet it was intelligently done. And unless you paid really close attention to the details and you read all of the documents that were cited in his memo, you really wouldn't necessarily perceive it as a work of advocacy. I did read everything that he cited, so I knew how much it was a work of persuasion, and how, to me, unfair it was. But I know, for example, to my colleagues on the faculty who did not take such interest in the gritty details, and who may not have read the historian's 60 or 70 page report, it was just another thing, another memo from the dean, right? And nothing special about it. And I guess I'll just deviate slightly to say that I think one of the reasons that I took this matter so seriously, as I did from the very first I ever learned of it, is because of my affiliation with Palestine, with another people undergoing dispossession and displacement and violence at the hands of a settler colonial movement. And so when I you know, when I learned the facts of this, it hit me hard, and I think in a way that it did not touch my colleagues. So, like I said, it was clear from the dean's brief that the administration was open to all other forms of restorative justice, but was dead set against a name change. And I was not happy with this result, and I learned eventually that there were others, some of them who had been a part of the committee and who had dissenting views, and eventually a group formed of us. And some of them were very eminent graduates of the college. A number of them were judges. We had like 4 or 5 judges who were part of this group. One of them was a tribal judge. One of them was a federal court judge, a very highly respected federal court judge. So it was an eminent group of people who began meeting and discussing how to respond to the dean's recommendation. And the board, by the way, the board of directors of the college, they always do what the dean says. So they adopted, and the decision of the board was to follow the dean's recommendation. Now, the next major development was a front-page New York Times article exposing Hastings' crimes, and it also exposing the school's inadequate response. And this was published, as I said, on the front page of the New York Times in October of 2021. As you may know, the New York Times is regarded as the paper of record in the United States. It's the most important news source, especially for elites, right? It's not what everybody reads on a daily basis, but it's where the elite communicates, to each other and about themselves and to the rest of the world. So 1 week later, on November 4th, the board, the Hastings board, held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to direct the dean to seek a name change through the state legislature. And so the state, a state senator from San Francisco, whose name is Scott Wiener, immediately introduced a bill in the state Senate. Now, the bill was narrowly tailored, and it would have changed the name, nothing more. But he had to find a partner in the other house of state government, in the state assembly. And so he reached out to a man, an assemblyman from Southern California, whose name is James Ramos. And he is the only native member of either the House, either the Assembly or the Senate. He's the only native person in California state government. And Ramos' first question to Wiener was, have you talked to any Indians? And of course he said no, right? I mean, and so, so at Ramos' insistence, a series of meetings were convened, some of which were private and some formal public hearings, in which Indian voices, mostly Yuki, but some others in addition, were clearly heard, and in which their desires were articulated, including support for Poe Nom and opposition to the University of California College of the Law, San Francisco, the name that was eventually adopted. So the board of the college met in late July and to decide on late July of 2022 to decide on a new name. And over the opposition of both UKI and some non-UKI voices, including mine, they voted unanimously to support University College of the Law, San Francisco. So in other words, they voted to change the name, but not the name that had been advocated, that had been requested by UKI survivors and a few allies like me. Ramos then introduced his version of the bill, not the one that Scott Wiener had drafted, adopting the board's recommendation, but also adding the 21 restorative justice measures that I mentioned. As I said, the college had always shown some willingness to adopt these restorative justice measures, but now they were obligated to do so under legal mandate. In other words, the 21 restorative justice measures were made part of the law that are legally enforceable against the college. And it was that bill that was eventually signed by the governor, and it came into force in January of this year. Now, that's a lot already of detail, and there's much more. This is a kind of a bare bones chronology, but it's enough for me to draw out some of the conclusions that I want to share with you. So, first of all, the college, initially, the college resisted a name change with all of its resources, but lost that battle. And then it fought with all of its resources to resist Poe Nom, the native name, and won that battle. Now, I don't have time to unravel or to explain to you all of the tactics that the college attempted at both of these stages. But believe me, they left no stone unturned. They tried every argument that they could possibly use, every tactic that they could possibly use. So why did we have this mixed result? The short answer is that I believe it's fair to say that today, in the state of California anyway, there is wide public acceptance of the principle of changing names of historical sites, removing statues, and the like, that carried over into the legislature. In other words, to some extent, the legislature was actually doing what it's supposed to do, which is to reflect the will of the people. Now, many things interrupt that process, as you probably anticipate. But in this case, it was quite clear that the politicians were operating in a favorable public environment for change. And there was this wide acceptance was somewhat comically revealed in a public hearing that I attended. It was a virtual meeting, but there were two opponents of change, of the name change, who were both graduates. They were both alumni of the college. One of them was a retired Superior Court judge, and the other was a retired Deputy Attorney General for the state of California. These are both people in the legal community who have stature and under normal circumstances would be afforded a fair degree of respect, especially in a formal hearing like in the legislature. But they testified, they gave their arguments against the name change, and one of the assembly members in the meeting referred to them as a couple of yahoos. And yahoo is a very insulting term. It means somebody who's rude or stupid, and particularly somebody who's from the country and unsophisticated and doesn't know anything, right? So here in a public setting, this guy's referring to these otherwise eminent, people who'd normally be given respect, calling them yahoos. This wouldn't have happened if he, that is the assembly member, calling them, insulting them to their faces, weren't comfortable in knowing, sensing that he had the political backing to be able to do that. However, there is still, and this is where Roberto cut straight to the chase, straight to the conclusion, there is still a lot of subliminal racism. It was just too much of a reach for people to think of a law school with a Yuki name. They just like they couldn't bring those two ideas together in their minds. A law school and a native name. No, I mean that just doesn't compute. And quite frankly, there is no other explanation for that in my mind than racism. Sadly, I will say that this was also true of my one indigenous colleague who ridiculed the idea of giving this was in private communication, I will say, and I'm not going to share the person's name, but this was it ridiculed the very notion of giving the college a Yuki name. Now, there were also, without doubt, money concerns, financial concerns, and these were never articulated. Again, a measure of the political strength of the support for name change. They couldn't say, well, they couldn't attack it frontally. They had to, figure out ways to argue against it. And of course, they knew, I'm sure the college sensed that saying, what's going to happen here is our donor base is going to stop giving money to the college, and we're going to be the laughing stock of the legal profession for having taken this crazy name. And so they were, but they would never say that. They would never say, oh, it's all about money, because that clearly would be a bad look in terms of the public view about what's at stake here, the moral issues at stake, and to have money be the reason for them not doing the right thing morally? No, they would never say that. So, a second thing to note were the two big turning points in this chronology, in this saga. First of all, there was the San Francisco Chronicle piece by the historian John Briscoe, which triggered the whole process, right? The college has been around since 1878, steaming along, nobody's bothering it about its name. Suddenly somebody publishes something and they click into gear and they start doing something. And then, of course, the even bigger one was the New York Times piece, which in 1 week turned around the entire administration. Everybody, we have to make this change. They knew about the change. I mean, they knew about the facts of underlying the case for the last 5 years and did nothing about it. But suddenly it became a moral imperative because of the New York Times. By the way, following, the New York Times has this feature, I'm sure many newspapers you read have the same, where the public can comment. There were 1,200 comments to this article. And almost all of them, and you know, the readership of the New York Times is pretty sophisticated, well-educated, you know, tearing the school apart and tearing the dean apart, right? Hundreds and hundreds of comments. You know, the legacy media, the old-time, you know, newspapers, which everybody thinks are dying, and they are in a certain sense and in a certain way. And of course, you have TikTok and, you know, and Twitter and or X, as it's now called. Whatever media, you know, they have a voice too. But the legacy media still has a great deal of power, especially with the elites. It's not unlimited power, right? I had a piece, I published a piece with actually the Yuki tribal leader in the San Francisco Chronicle advocating for the name Poe Nom, and we didn't succeed, right? You know, it's not like anything in the media will immediately produce this dramatic result. It didn't when we were trying to get this done. But it is a significant power, and one which it's definitely a partner to seek out for those who are seeking change, at least in certain circumstances. The measure here, for example, may be different. The balance of forces may be different, but in the United States, at least, the legacy media still have significant power. A third conclusion is, I think it's fair to say that we would have had name change legislation without James Ramos. As you recall, the San Francisco guy, Scott Wiener, the state senator, had introduced a bill to change the name, and it probably would have passed. But it's equally fair to say that James Ramos' engagement and actually taking over the initiative for the legislation made the difference between a sort of a bare bones, simple change to UC College of the Law, San Francisco, and the actual AB 1936 with those 21 restorative justice measures. He was amazing, James Ramos was. Of course, he was the one responsible for bringing Yuki voices into the process. He himself spoke with a great deal of power and eloquence. His own tribe had been subject to virtually identical crimes in the 19th century. It happened all over the state of California, actually, in this from the beginning of statehood in 1848 until the sort of the 1870s. Mass killings of Indians were occurring all over the state. So he really empathized, and Ramos saw this name change as a model for other changes going forward. He clearly wants to initiate a process, not end a process, but to start a process that will be more thoroughgoing. And it's also apparent that his peers in the legislature really listened to him. They really heard what he said, and I think it's for that reason that there were absolutely no negative votes ever on this bill. Now, it's also important that Ramos, had paved the way with earlier legislation to remove a statue from the Capitol, from the state Capitol grounds. It was a statue honoring Junipero Serra, who was a Catholic priest who had been kind of the leader of the mission, the establishment of Catholic missions by the Spaniards in the well, starting in the 16th century and extending for several centuries. 21 were eventually established in the state of California. So Ramos had fought and won the battle to have that statue removed from the state grounds. And in that process, he had put the entire legislature through a process of education. So when they came to the Hastings issue, it wasn't the first time they'd heard these kinds of considerations and these kinds of moral judgments. Now, the upshot for me, I mean, the conclusion I draw from this is for indigenous peoples, it really makes a difference to have native voices in positions of power. It's not enough just to be heard by others, but to speak with one's own voice has a power that is special. So, you know, if you are indigenous, run for office. I mean, that's my advice to people in the United States. You know, you would have to take your own measure of the circumstances here. Fourth and lastly, and I'm getting close to the end here. This pains me to say on several levels. One of the most effective tactics of the college, first in resisting the name change and then in resisting poenom, was enlisting people of color, native people, and others to support their positions. This started with the president of what's called the Round Valley Indian tribes. In California, as in many other places, when white settlement really kicked into high gear, in California it was kind of muted for a long time. And then with the gold rush in 1849, floods of white settlers came in, and that's when the real expansion occurred. And that's why the genocides occurred when they did, because suddenly there were a lot more white people. They needed to eat. There was money to be made by raising livestock. Much of it was livestock. And that's what Hastings himself was trying to do. He bought land and wanted to put cattle there, and pigs and other livestock to feed the fast-growing population. So anyway, what happened was that tribes were forced off of their lands, and they were all concentrated together in reservations, in small plots of land. And they were, they didn't even necessarily speak the same languages, and some of them were actually enemies of each other in the pre-contact period. The Yuki, by the way, the name Yuki actually is not a Yuki name. It comes from one of the neighboring tribes, and it means enemy in that neighboring tribe's language. So they were forced into this living with 7 other tribes in this very concentrated small area, and they eventually won recognition from the federal government as the consolidated tribes of the Round Valley. So the president of the Round Valley Indian tribes was not a Yuki himself, and he was one of the people that the college enlisted in support of not having a name change. So, for example, he and the dean together wrote an opinion piece against the name change, right? The school enlisted a leader of the Ramaytush Ohlone tribe, which is the tribe on which the land of Hastings in the city of San Francisco is built, right? To say that naming a building in his ancestors, on his ancestors' land after the Yuki would be an insult to his tribe and his ancestors. There was a Yuki family that was in favor of retaining the name. fine, they're entitled to their perspective. They thought it would show forgiveness and generosity and largesse of heart to not change the name. They were not representative of the feelings of the tribe overall, but they were trotted out time and time again by the college as saying, the Yuki themselves don't want a name change. And then there was a single black member of the Hastings board who voted in support against Poe Nom and in support of the other change, who argued this. He was the one who came closest to acknowledging the financial concerns in his speech to the board, explaining his vote against Poe Nom. And then my indigenous colleague, I don't want to say too much because I don't really want to embarrass that person, but various benefits were offered and accepted. Now it was partly our failure to reach out and to effectively negotiate with these people who, to my view, should have been our natural allies. But it's also typical of settler colonial administrations to dangle these various benefits to recruit indigenous collaborators. And of course, they are the ones with the resources. So they are capable of making these offers that we can't make, Now, there is a postscript, and I'm almost done. Forgive me if I've taken much longer than I expected. The Yahoos, if you remember them, and some descendants of Serranus Hastings, his family members, have filed a lawsuit against the college and the legislature to bar the change. The legal basis seems weak. They've already suffered one significant legal setback. They had another minor victory, but it looks like their lawsuit will not succeed. Now, our attentions are shifting, and when I say our, I mean the group of people who supported the name Poe Nom, and who want to make sure that the college actually honors its commitments. We are looking at the 21 restorative justice measures, and we want to make sure that they're actually enacted. None of us has given up the future possibility of a Yuki name for the college. Our Yuki spokespeople in the hearings very poignantly spoke about why the name San Francisco was hardly restorative justice to them, because to them it merely invoked the horrors of the California mission system, which I mentioned earlier, what I didn't say was that entailed the fairly significant enslavement and abuse of Native peoples. And part of AB 1936 provides that if the city of San Francisco itself ever changes its name, like, for example, in India, Bombay was changed to Mumbai not that long ago, then the issue of the name of the college would be reopened. So as several of my friends in this effort have commented, could we have imagined that the name of the college would have been changed? Would we have gotten here? Could you imagine this? The answer clearly would have been no. But we did. We succeeded in part. Just in closing, I will say that if any of you are contemplating such an effort, do it. And don't look at the odds of success in advance. You never really know what will be the outcome of a political struggle. And if you put your heart into it, you can achieve a result like this. Maybe you can do better, and I sure hope so. Thank you. Thank you.
Bom, há alguma pergunta? Pois não, Paulo. Pode, por favor.
I would like to ask you, Professor George, first I would like to thank you for your...
Aqui, ó. Eita ferro.
So again, thank you for your presentation. Thank you for speaking to us again. When analyzing causality and exploring consequences of what you described earlier, you mentioned the power of legacy media in what I felt was a hopeful way, like a promising power or like a site or a means to advance what was not object of victory at this time. And later you mentioned a failure to dialogue with actors, social actors that could be considered natural allies of
Yeah.
progressist policies.
Yeah.
And I was hoping for you to comment, like what would be like a proper means to make what could be called cultural politics, like publishing pieces, would that be a means of establishing dialogue that could be effective? Or, you know, like the public intellectual behavior, would that be a behavior for us, you know, more younger researchers, you know?
Well,
Thank you.
yeah, thanks. And thank you again, Paula, for the translation of the outline.
We'll have see if somebody else.
Several
okay?
questions? Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
three.
Let me
three,
just
three.
take okay.
Existem mais perguntas? Porque a intenção é que nós possamos reunir 3 perguntas para ele poder responder e assim a gente consegue otimizar o tempo. Não, se quiserem fazer a pergunta em português, nós vertemos para o inglês, gente.
Não tem problema.
Não tem problema. Não? Estão tímidos?
Nada. Ok. There's no...
Okay. I don't need that.
Oh, yeah.
I use this. I guess I answered most of your questions already. You know, absolutely, I think it is part of the process of building building support in different realms to engage in research and writing and what you termed cultural politics. You know, what you might write will have impact on some groups, some people. It's not a substitute, I would say, for the nitty-gritty of individual politics and negotiating with people, because no matter what, you know, sort of cultural politics and what broad culture you are able to establish, there are always going to be deviants. It's not really, I mean, there will always be exceptions, people who aren't convinced. They will be the ones who are sought out by, you know, in other words, you know, there will always be, I use the term collaborators. I realize that's a rather rough, you know, derogatory term, but the forces that you're aligned against will always find those people. So in our case, you know, we knew who they were. We knew the individuals, right, that they were working with. We just didn't have the time and the access and the, you know, the resources. I mean, all of this, by the way, was occurring during COVID, most of it, and so a lot of these, almost, I mean, all of the meetings that I've referred to, except, well, they were either online, they were on Zoom, or they were hybrid at best, right? So we weren't in the same spaces physically as these individuals. We couldn't corner them, we couldn't talk to them, we couldn't appeal to them. We made some attempts to, to negotiate with some of them that were rebuffed. So it wasn't easy. And I don't think it ever is, but I think those challenges are endemic, and like I said, whatever you write, whatever you research and publish about, it's not gonna obviate the challenge of these collaborators. You will always face them, and you have to deal with them in another way. And it's like I said, it's an uphill battle, because I don't have an Indian law research center to offer to my indigenous colleague, and I'm not the dean and chancellor, and so when the dean and chancellor invites this Yuki family to dinner at his house and, fawns over them, they don't care about, I don't have that kind of stature to seduce them, right? So it's not an easy thing to overcome. But as to your question about the building of the cultural politics, absolutely do it. It will help. It'll take care of part of the problem. It just won't take care of all of the problem.
Alguma outra questão?
I have three questions, but they are not exactly on this particular subject.
Yeah.
The first one is about the Bruce speech, victory to get back their lands. And I was wondering which arguments were used. Were used, this kind of the race, or the etc., or administrative arguments like the compensation was not
Right.
proper,
Right.
whatever,
Right.
this kind of thing.
Right.
And this kind of land to public universities also, I would like to know that there is compensation, for these people. How does it work? The third thing is is to say that I went to a similar situation in Itaipu, Niterói, when I was there, doing my field work for my master dissertation in the 70s. And then there was a big corporation which was, a developer, land developer. And then they were working to transform, part of the beach in a very exclusive condominium, which they did. But in the means of it, the process of doing so, they bought houses from the people, not only fishermen, but people who had houses in the next to the beach. They bought them, and also they employed some fishermen, as drivers of trucks and things like that for the things that they were doing.
Sure.
And then at the time, my friends, Seu Chico and Natalino, the late Natalino, were very angry, with this kind of these families
Yeah.
which accepted
Right.
another offer because they opened, a kind of place, a very, but far from the beach.
Yeah.
But loteamento, I don't know, developing land. Yeah. And it was called Mara Vista, seashore view
Yeah.
in the middle of the land. These guys lived in the the beach.
Yeah.
Yeah, they got them there and put
Yeah.
them in a place which was called,
Well, they had a better view.
yeah. Yeah. And it was called Sea at Your Vista, Mar à Vista.
Yeah. Yeah.
You look at this thing. But yeah. It was kind of not only ridiculous, but a little bit offensive, I think
Yeah,
so. But
sure,
anyway.
Sure.
And then there was, a big fight, and of course they won, and they don't won everything
Yeah.
because they wanted everything. They didn't get the part of the beach where you were,
Yeah.
but we were on Saturday.
Yeah.
But they won the rest of the beach, including that channel. It was built, there is a channel between that place that we are
Yeah.
and the rest of the
I see.
beach. You
Right.
didn't go
Right.
there, but it's more to if you are looking at the sea, more
Right, to the
your
right.
right.
Yeah.
There is
Yeah.
a channel, and they opened that channel with, state money to
Yeah. Right.
to serve as a place where you put, the jets, of the condominium, you put
Yeah.
in the lake, in the lagoon, and the channel was built to
Oh, I see.
take
Take it out.
to take it out.
Yeah.
It was written in the what was published,
Right, right.
officially published, and of the financing of this. But the statics are very, as you said, are very common.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
and always somebody accepts.
Yeah, of course.
It's
Yeah.
it's always
Right.
because these people themselves, fishermen, they are not
Yeah, they're not
a community, strongly,
Yeah.
it's not. So that's it.
Yeah, so in the struggle over Bruce Beach, the struggle, as I understand it, now I'm not a resident of Los Angeles, and I was mostly a distant spectator and read about it more when the result was brought about than, that I was not intimately involved in it. But my impression, so first of all, what happened was the city council, or no, I guess it was the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors, reversed the eminent domain finding, right? So it was an exercise by the city of the power of eminent domain, and then it was an exercise by the county, which is a superior political authority, to reverse the declaration of eminent domain and to return the property to the family. And my impression is that the arguments and the discussions were primarily political and not juridical. It was not because of a technicality. I'm sure there were, there were legal dimensions, that the exercise of eminent domain in American law is not unlimited. It cannot be done for illegitimate purposes. It can't be done because the mayor of the city wants to build an apartment for himself or his family on a particular piece of land. There are proper.
Está falando de desapropriação, né?
Yeah, there are proper and improper exercises of eminent domain, and we do have an equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment, which of the United States Constitution, which is applicable to all of the states and all of the entities that derive their power from the states, such as counties and municipalities. And so, you know, you could easily imagine how the moral and political arguments and the legal arguments would be virtually identical. You know, that this was a discriminatory exercise to enforce racial segregation against, you know, against this family. But the way it was, the move wasn't, you know, it wasn't a judge deciding that the family should have the land back. It was the city, and those guys are politicians, right? They're responding to the political atmosphere around them. So that's about Bruce Beach. Now, with universities, I'm not aware yet of a successful attempt to gain either return or compensation for public lands. Now, you know, keep in mind that on which universities have been built. There was legislation in the 19th century that established these, they were land grant universities. They were specifically they were sort of bequests or behests from the federal government to the states specifically for the purpose of establishing public universities. And they took federal land, meaning Indian land, and gave it to the states, right? I mean, it was land under the control of the federal government, which by treaty obligation that they had, you know, that they had earlier concluded with Indian tribes was actually land that the government was supposed to be respecting as the sovereign territory of the Indian tribes. They just didn't do it. They just didn't. They ignored their treaty obligations and gave the land to the states. So it's these specific universities that are facing this challenge, and I'm not sure. It's a fairly new move, at least as I'm newly aware of it, let's put it that way, and I haven't seen that one has yet gone to conclusion. About Itaipu and California, and now I can add Palestine, these tactics of recruiting collaborators are universal. I think they're universal to settler colonialism. They're not, I mean, I will just say that when I use the term collaborator, yes, I say it with a little tinge of I mean, I intend it to be somewhat derogatory, but you also have to kind of sympathize with the reality that's being faced by people in these circumstances who are being ground into the dirt by these forces that are much more powerful than they are, and which they are just trying to negotiate, you know, just trying to negotiate their own survival. You know, I read about the early settlement, the very first white settlers who went to the Round Valley in the Eden Valley, where Hastings later, you know, did his thing, right, committed his genocide. And they, you know, the white settlers basically treated this like a paradise. It's supposed to be a very beautiful place. I have not yet visited it. I need to go there. It was a paradise full of everything that they wanted, expansive grasses for for grazing their livestock. They were, you know, it was full of deer that they killed and at the rate of 15 a day to make buckskin that they were then selling. And it had Indians, and they took Indians and sold them as slaves to Mexican traders, you know? So it was like this wonderful place full of resources to be exploited, including the natives. You know, they were not really that different from the deer and the other bounty of the land, you know? They were part of the landscape. I mean, humans, maybe, they kind of look like humans, but, you know, we can do what we want with them. And there were, even then, there were, I'll use the term again, collaborator. There were collaborators who sold, in particular the slavers, the people who enslaved natives, were mostly interested in women and children, if you can, you know, and they wanted them for domestic services ranging from sexual services to cooking and cleaning and all those things. That's what the interest was. And so there were native men who, you know, who sold their female, you know, relatives into slavery. And, you know, what options did they have? You know, what options did they have? They could have resisted and they would have been killed. You know? So
Everybody would be killed. Everybody.
Yeah, everybody would be killed. So I use the term with a little bit of irony and a little bit of humility also, and understanding of how challenging it is to be in that situation. And, you know, I won't go on further, just to say exactly the same thing has occurred in Palestine and is occurring. That is, with land, there are Palestinians who, even in the, you know, when the Zionist movement first started to try to establish a land base in Palestine in the 19th century, their principal means was land purchase, not expropriation the way it is today, and forcible seizure. That wasn't the way they did it. They started by buying. And there were Palestinians and others, by the way, there were landowners from Lebanon and other countries, surrounding countries, who were willing to sell. You know, they had, I mean, hey, somebody's offering me a ton of money for land, you know, why not? And this has, you know, this has continued. And, you know, today we have the Palestinian Authority, you know, this creature of the 1993 so-called Oslo Accords, and its principal function in life is to protect the Israeli settler population against resistance by the Palestinians. So, I mean, that's not what its ostensible function is, but that's what its real function is. So these things are a reflection of the immense asymmetry of power. That's ultimately what it's about. And so just remember that I use this term collaborator with a full appreciation of the horrible reality that you know, that people face, and what the tough choices that they're faced with, and how often they are compelled to do things that they would, I'm sure, in their, you know, in their better days would love not to do. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bom, queridos, nós vamos agora dar um pequeno intervalo. Estão todos convidados para o nosso buffet, ok? Que vai ser no
Comida.
Lab 10 no final do corredor, ok? E aí, a próxima mesa, nós vamos começar por volta de 1h30. Como o evento atrasou, nós jogamos 1h30, 1h40, ok? E para nós começarmos, tá bom?
2 horas, né?
2 horas.
2 horas, porra.
Yeah.
Termina lá e vem pra cá. É
Isso.
assim. Pronto.
Tá bom? Muito obrigado.
Vem aí.